Hello, this is Jonathan with Steel Bear Academy. Today is going to be a really beginner-focused lesson. This is all about the 4 rules of gun safety. So if you're new to guns, this is definitely for you. In gun handling, in the gun world, we have these 4 rules. And these 4 rules are intended to keep all of us safe. We follow them almost 100% of the time. Very, very, very few exceptions, and I actually am going to do a video on exceptions to these rules, but at the beginning, you should assume that these rules there are no exceptions, and generally there are very, very few exceptions. So pretend like follow these rules all the time. So when we talk about the 4 rules of gun safety, usually we're referring to these rules that were codified or really solidified by this guy named Jeff Cooper, who's a really famous and very influential gun activist and gun enthusiast and hunter and kind of a renaissance man of guns, really. However, Jeff Cooper's version of the 4 rules of gun safety, we as a community have kind of taken and tweaked just a little bit and changed the wording a little bit. And in rules, the wording of the rules really can make a big difference. So I'm going to give you my version of the rules, and my version is different than Jeff Cooper's rules, and I'll try to explain why I give the version I give as opposed to sticking to the version that is Jeff Cooper's rules. But I'm going to try to also give you some examples of rules are only good if you understand what they're supposed to keep you doing, but you also need to understand what they are trying to prevent you from doing. So it's very easy if you just read the rules and say, okay, treat every gun as if it's loaded. Well, that is very simple. It's simple in a kind of a bad way, honestly, because there's a whole bunch of assumptions built into that we're going to try to cover and hopefully show you some of the things you want to avoid. It's easy to say in the affirmative, do this, but if you don't show all the things that you might do a little wrong along the way, it's not going to make as much sense. So for today, I'm going to be using a gun. This is a 1911. It is unloaded. I would not be using a live gun for this, but it's unloaded, but I will keep the safety on for this duration of this video. This gun is unloaded. I showed you, I visualized, I showed you as well. I showed myself. We're not worried about ammunition. There's no ammunition in the room. However, don't try this at home. I'm demonstrating for you for educational purposes. So this is our gun that we'll be using today. If I break any of these 4 rules, I hopefully am doing them on purpose to show you a bad way to do it. So I will tell you, don't do this. So follow along with me. So the first rule of gun safety is keep your gun pointed in a safe direction. Another way to word this is never let your muzzle cover anything you are not willing to destroy. So there are 2 different wordings here. One is keep your gun pointed in a safe direction. That one sounds pretty self-explanatory. So long as you don't allow this gun to point at anything that is unsafe. What does unsafe mean? Well, unsafe means 1, anything human, myself included, so I don't allow it to point at myself. I don't allow it to point at anyone else. I don't allow it to point at animals. So this is kind of where that second version of it comes into play. Anything you're not willing to destroy. Don't let it cover, don't let the muzzle, meaning the side that the bullets come out of, don't let the muzzle cover anything you're not willing to destroy. So you can imagine there's kind of like a laser beam coming out of this gun. As I sweep it across, everything that it touches could potentially be destroyed, including myself. So I don't allow myself to cover that laser. I'm going to break the rules so you can understand what I'm talking about. What we call muzzling is when you allow your hand or any part of your body or any person to break that laser that is coming out of that line. So this is breaking that rule. It's keeping the gun pointed in a safe direction. I broke that rule right here. Now, at the range, so this is kind of our makeshift range, by the way. Imagine that this is the bench. It goes as far off as it goes. And then our target is downrange. At the range, It's even a little more specific. When we're at the range, we usually think of there being a 180-degree line that is moving from where we are out. And you want all of your guns pointed in that direction, down range. That's where the targets are set up. And at the range, keeping the gun pointed in a safe direction really only means that you should be pointing it from about here to here, as in you have about this much of a degree of safe direction. They don't want you pointing it over here. They don't want you pointing it over here. From here to here is a safe direction. You don't want it pointing up. People generally don't even like it pointing down. This is about as safe as you can get at the range. And that's what the range wants. They don't want you pointing in an unsafe direction. The range is extra strict on this rule in a way that the real world, meaning, let's say you were not at the range, let's say you were out hunting or something. In the real world, it just means point it in the safest direction. There could be, if you have to choose between a place where there are no people versus a place where there are people, then you should pick the place to point it where there are no people. So really you're trying to keep it in a direction where there are no people. Now sometimes this is not possible, so that might be an exception to the rule. In the real world, you might encounter times where there is no safe direction. Any direction, if your gun went off for some reason, really no direction is very safe. In that case, you pick the safest direction. Now, this is getting a little bit deeper than what a newbie perhaps would need to know, but you want to think about, that's basically what you want to think about. You want to think, what's the safest direction that I can point it? Now, there's a couple ways people mess this one up. The biggest way they mess it up, so remember we're at the range. Imagine that I'm manipulating my gun and I'm picking it up and I'm gonna maybe chamber some rounds. Now, I don't have any rounds here, but imagine. So imagine I pick up my gun and then I start to try to rack my slide. Well, do you see the problem over here? The problem is that I'm pointing down the firing line. That is breaking that rule. I'm pointing it in an unsafe direction. Now, the way you would do this without breaking that rule is you'd keep the gun pointed down range, but I'd turn my body. Now I'm doing the same motion. I'm still racking the slide, but now my gun is pointed in a safe direction, down range. Alternatively, you could rack the slide like this. So you can move your body. Your gun needs to stay that way, but you can move your body around it. So if I want to move my body, I could do that. Now, if you're brand new, you probably should just keep the gun on the table until you're ready to shoot. When it's time to shoot, you pick it up, load your rounds, take your shots, and then put it right back on the table. Best to not do too much manipulation. That's when you might tend to make a mistake. However, just keep that in mind. Keep the gun pointed down range. Another way people typically mess this one up is, let's say there's two friends or maybe a couple, like maybe a boyfriend and a girlfriend, and one of them's going to be shooting at the target, and the other's going to be standing where you're standing, kind of to the right or maybe a little bit behind. One of them will be shooting, and they'll take some shots, bang, 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 and they'll say, "Honey, did you see that?" And they'll whip around. Hopefully you saw what went wrong there. I pointed the gun at you. Don't want to do that. That's breaking rule number 1, right? So when you're shooting, it's very easy to get distracted because it's an exciting activity. You want to think of there being like a string pulling your gun toward the end of the line here. Another way people mess this one up is when they are going to manipulate their gun. They're going to typically rack rounds into and out of the chamber on a semi-auto gun. They're racking their slide, let's say. And as they insert their magazine, rack the slide, they sometimes bring their hand in front of the gun. And that's breaking rule number 1, right? We're putting our hand in an unsafe spot. This is muzzling myself. So this is another thing to be aware of. When you rack your slide, make sure you come around and under to bring your other hand together. So those are the two ways I typically see people messing this one up. You want to make sure you don't accidentally point it at yourself either. If you're doing something like maybe you just saw something downrange and you say, "Hey, do you see that down there?" That'd be bad. We don't want to put our hand in front of our gun. Now I'm doing this for demonstration purposes, just so you can understand this. If you need to point at something, either you need to keep the gun in front of you, like so, or best to do is just to set it down. Just set your gun down and then you can point down there. That's better. Ideally, your gun would be unloaded, but people don't typically do that when they're just pointing. It's okay to set your gun down while you're still in the middle of shooting. Anytime you're not shooting your gun, you should unload it though. At the range, it's best to keep your gun open, magazine out of the gun, and with your action unlocked, like so. So that's rule number 1. Jeff Cooper's version of this rule is, never let the muzzle cover anything you are not prepared to destroy. I changed it a little bit and said always keep your gun pointed in a safe direction. They're really very similar, however, one's a little more specific. I think Jeff Cooper's is a little more specific, however, it doesn't roll off the tongue as well. Always keep your gun pointed in a safe direction. Jeff Cooper also lists that as rule number 2. Rule number 1 for Jeff Cooper is always treat every gun as if they are loaded. So I put that rule as number 1. Never let the muzzle cover anything you're not willing to destroy. Always keep your gun pointed in a safe direction. I think that is the most important rule. I think that rule combined with number 2 are the 2 rules that keep you safe more than any other rules. So I think they are more important to list them first. So rule number 2 is keep your finger outside the trigger guard, off the trigger, until you're on target ready to shoot. Now another way to say this is keep your finger off the trigger until your sights are on the target. So what does that mean exactly? So what that means is we're referring to, on a gun, we're referring to the trigger. That's this piece right here, the silver part with the holes in it. That's the trigger. The trigger guard is this metal piece that encloses and protects the trigger from being accidentally pulled. So again, the rule is keep your finger outside the trigger guard until you're on target ready to shoot. So what that means is anytime I'm handling the gun, I keep my finger off the trigger, meaning I don't touch the trigger, and I keep it outside the trigger guard, like so. And on semi-auto pistols, usually we like to rest it on this part here called the frame. So the frame is the bottom part here, the slide is the top part. The slide moves forward and backward. So you see I'm kind of resting my finger along the frame. Now the reason we do that, the reason that is a rule, why we always keep our finger off the trigger until we're on target ready to shoot, is because the gun can't fire unless we pull the trigger. So our finger being extended straight like this is that which keeps us safe from accidentally firing the gun. Now, when the gun is just sitting on the table like this, the way in which I would go to pick it up, I don't pick it up with my fingers like this. I make sure that one of my fingers, my index finger, is extended straight. Now, this is not how you pick something up normally. This is part of learning a new discipline of learning how to use guns. This is called trigger discipline, is keeping your finger extended, because this is not natural. You have to train yourself to do this. So I go to pick up my gun, I extend my hand out, I keep my finger extended, I pick up the grip of the gun, but I keep my finger along the frame, outside the trigger guard, not touching the trigger. So pretty self-explanatory, right? However, like everything, there are some nuances. When we're talking about keeping our finger off the trigger, what we're talking about is trying to avoid the way in which the gun fires, but we're also trying to hedge our bets against human nature. So if I just said keep your finger off the trigger, well, you might be inclined to say this is off the trigger. Well, we don't want to do this. We want to keep our finger up and away from the trigger totally outside the trigger guard. I should be able to see through the trigger guard if I'm looking at it from the other side. The reason being, if our finger is just resting here, or kind of resting maybe over the trigger, kind of like this, when you get startled, you don't keep your index finger extended and, ooh, something startled me. You don't do this. You clasp all fingers together. You know, if you're kind of resting and someone slaps you on the back, you'll clasp all your fingers together. And if you were keeping your finger along here, you might inadvertently stick your finger on the trigger and shoot your gun accidentally. That would be bad, right? So that's why we keep it outside the trigger guard. We are trying to hedge our bets against automatic human responses. Now, the other part of this rule is keep your finger outside the trigger guard, which we covered, until you're on target, ready to shoot. So what does that mean exactly, and why do we do it? So imagine we're at the range. Here's our bench. We go to pick our gun up. I keep my finger off the trigger until I'm on target, ready to shoot. So maybe I grab my magazine, insert it into the gun, chamber around, get my grip, get my stance, my finger's still off the trigger, bring my gun up in front of my eyes, take my safety off if I haven't already, and I decide I'm gonna take some shots. So I'm on target, I got my sights pointed at the target, and I decide I'm gonna take some shots. Bang, 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 bang. So this is on target, ready to shoot. I've made the decision to shoot. So why do we word it that way? Well, we word it that way because we want to differentiate between like administration of your gun, meaning moving it around, and the time in which you can put your finger on the trigger. So the rule is to always have your finger off the trigger, except in two scenarios. Two conditions have to be met. One is you have to get your sights on the target. So that would mean here. So this is condition one. This is the first condition. And second, I have to decide that I'm going to take some shots. That's the second condition. Then I take some shots. Bang, bang, bang. If I decide to stop shooting, I take my finger outside the trigger guard. And this is where typically the newbies mess up a lot. And it's partly a fault of the rules, really. The rules don't adequately explain that when you're not shooting, you take your finger off the trigger and outside the trigger guard. Now, the rules as they are written make sense, but until you actually do it a bunch and somebody tells you, hey, finger off the trigger, what typically was going on was maybe you were shooting and then all of a sudden, I messed up there. Maybe you were shooting and all of a sudden you say, hey, John, do you think, and someone yells, finger off the trigger. Oh, okay, then you take it out like that. So again, there's kind of what I consider, the way in which I think of it is, the normal mode of operation is finger off the trigger. The only times I get to break that normal rule is when I'm on target and I'm deciding I'm going to take some shots right now, like within the next second or so. Anytime I'm not shooting, like maybe I'm not shooting right that second, I'll take my finger off the trigger. My sights may still be on target, but I'm not shooting at the moment. Maybe I'm talking to somebody. So that's what we call trigger discipline. And it's not so simple as just don't touch the trigger. There's a bunch of stuff that we're trying to avoid happening. We're trying to avoid any unnecessary accidental or negligent discharges of your gun. And this is how we do it. These two rules together are really the crux of gun safety. And they work together. They kind of are redundant for each other. So they're redundant in the sense that if I am pointing, let's say somebody's downrange and I point at them, that's breaking rule number one, right? Well, if I follow rule number two, keeping my finger off the trigger, I haven't hurt anybody. We haven't caused an irrevocable damage. We haven't shot that person on accident. Same thing applies if I break rule number two. Let's say I accidentally pull the trigger and somebody's right there. I accidentally pull the trigger bang. Rule number 1 saved me there. I kept it pointed in a safe direction. I accidentally fired the gun. That's bad. That's a negligent discharge. But rule number 1 saved me from having a terrible accident, right? So these rules work together to keep us safe. So rule number 3, this one is identify your target, what's around it, and what's beyond it. The Jeff Cooper version of this is be sure of your target. What does that mean exactly? Be sure of your target. Well, I think my version is a little more specific. It's 3 things: identify your target, what's around it, and what's beyond it. So imagine that we're out in the field, let's say, and I've set this target up out in a nice field of grass. I need to know that when I pick up my gun, or really whenever I'm planning on shooting this target, I need to know what it is I'm shooting at. I need to know that that's my paper target set out there in the field, and I'm shooting at my paper target out there in the field. I need to know what it is that I'm shooting at. The way people mess this one up is you don't want to just shoot at something you're not quite sure what it is. Like, let's say you're hunting and you hear a rustling in the bushes, and you bring out your gun and you shoot at it. Now, you might have thought, oh, it's an animal, it's a wild animal in the bush. Well, what if it isn't? What if it was a human? That would be incredibly bad, right? We just shot somebody. That's terrible. That's awful. So identify your target. You need to know what it is you're shooting at. The same applies if it was dark. So let's say you think you hear somebody breaking into your house. You hear some broken glass, and you go out there with your gun and you see somebody wrestling around. You bring it up and you shoot them. What if it was somebody you know? What if it was somebody who didn't break in? They maybe stumbled in. Maybe they thought it was their house. Maybe it was your kid who, accidentally knocked over something while they were sleeping in the living room or something. You need to know what it is you're shooting at before you take some shots. So that's why a light is so important on a home defense gun, for example. You don't want to just shoot at something you don't know what it is. Identify the target, number 1. Number 2, know what's around it. So that means that if I'm looking at my target out there in the field, I need to look left and right and make sure there's nothing around my target, meaning kind of to the left and right of it. That makes sense, right? If we're just so focused on the target, we forget to look around. That's bad. We need to know the whole field of view. Number 3, what's beyond it? Know your target and what's beyond it. So that means that if it's sitting out there in the field, I don't have to just stop wherever the target is. I need to know what's past the target, what's beyond it, because my bullets will pierce through the target. Also, I could miss and it might go past my target. I need to know that my bullets are not going to hurt something or, damage something beyond my target. We are responsible for every round that we send downrange. Every round we fire out of our gun, we are responsible for. So you really got to make sure. Now, there are different kind of intensity levels of needing to put this into practice. Like, for example, at the indoor range, you're probably not going to have to worry too much about what's around it or beyond it. To some extent, you should be aware of your surroundings. Make sure while you're shooting down lane, make sure somebody doesn't walk down the firing line, which they shouldn't do, but maybe they do. You just need to make sure that you're not so focused on the target that you don't look around. Now, out in the real world, this rule is incredibly important out in the real world. So let's say you're not at a range. Maybe you're hunting, or maybe you're walking downtown and you've got your concealed carry permit, and somebody tries to mug you with a knife, and you decide you're going to defend yourself with your gun and shoot them. Well, when you're shooting the bad guy, you need to know that your bullets might go past the bad guy. And there might be people walking along who are not aware of what's going on between you two. They might walk in front of you, and you need to be aware of that. And that's really tough, right? That'd be incredibly stressful to, have a life or death situation in front of you, but people are moving around you. But that's what's necessary. You need to understand that. So, rule number 3, identify your target, what's around it, and what's beyond it. Number 4, this is treat all guns as if they are loaded. So that's my version of this. Rule number 1 for Jeff Cooper. So this is rule number 1. His rule number 1 is my number 4. His rule number 1 is all guns are always loaded. So what does that mean exactly? So this is actually an interesting thing I learned about the other day. I was watching a kind of a debate, and they were talking about how there are certain concepts that we just, even though we factually know they are not true, we act out as if they are true because it is a net positive. It's the benefit we get by just pretending it's true is actually better than if we tried to more accurately say, it's not true here, it is true here, and try to sort it out. Instead, just say it's always true and just plan out your whole life as if it is always true. That was a debate with Sam Harris, by the way, in case you were curious. So the rule is treat all guns as if they are loaded. Another way of saying that to me is don't get complacent with the other rules. So I should follow all those rules all the time, right? Rules 1 through 3. Rule number 4 is saying, even if I know my gun is unloaded, even if I know this gun is unloaded, I don't treat it any differently. I don't treat it any differently. I don't break any of those other rules just because I know it's unloaded. Now, obviously, I've broken it for the purposes of this video, but there's kind of a secondary part of Jeff Cooper's version of this rule. So the secondary part is until you have, well, I'll just read it verbatim. The only exception to this occurs when one has a weapon in his hand and he has personally unloaded it for checking. As soon as he puts it down, rule number 1 applies again. So again, rule number 1 is all guns are always loaded. So for Jeff Cooper, he says there's an exception. The exception is when you have personally looked, make sure your gun is unloaded, and you personally know that the gun in your hand is unloaded. As soon as you set it down, rule number 1 is back in effect. If you pick it up again, I got to make sure it's unloaded again. Now, this is a good thing. We want to treat all guns as if they are loaded. Typically, when people hurt somebody accidentally or negligently, those words are slightly different meanings, but we typically refer to a negligent discharge as one in which you shot the gun and the gun was working correctly. An accidental discharge might be a mechanical failure of the gun, but you also broke one of the rules of pointing it in an unsafe direction. So the way in which we avoid negligent discharges, predominantly, following all the rules, but number 4 is really encompassing all the rules that came before it. If we break one of those first rules, if we point the gun at somebody who we shouldn't be pointing it at, or a thing or a person or whoever, if the gun goes off, well, we just broke rule number 1 and number 4. We probably also broke rule number 2 by pulling the trigger. So if we treat all of the guns as if they are loaded, we pretend they are loaded, well, then we don't have to differentiate between this is a loaded gun, this is an unloaded gun. With the unloaded gun, I don't have to follow the rules as much. No, with every gun, you have to follow all the rules all the time. We don't make exceptions for, well, I don't really have to follow 1 and 2 because I know the gun's unloaded. We don't do that. Instead, we just say, this is a gun, we'll just treat it as if it's loaded. It may very well be unloaded, but we'll treat it the same anyway because that's the safer thing to do. So in my version of it is, if we had to put it in a nutshell, it's basically don't get complacent with the other rules. Even if I know this gun's unloaded, even if I have verified it myself, I still treat it as if it's loaded. I don't point it at other people. I don't allow my finger to touch the trigger. I keep my finger outside the trigger guard, etc. At the range, we don't have an exception for unloaded guns, really. Like you don't get to turn your gun, you don't get to turn down range and point it down the firing line just because your gun is unloaded. Typically what you do is you would keep it upright or down, though typically I think at ranges they seem to prefer upright. And really it's a matter of, trying to point it in the safest direction. Many ranges don't want you moving around at all. They want you to unbox your gun, set it on the table, put your box back, and then do all your shooting. Keep it always pointed down range, and then get your box when you're ready to leave, bring it over, box it up, lock it up, take it with you. But they don't want you going from the bench to back to the rear of the range or anything like that. So it all depends on your specific range. But so these are the 4 rules of gun safety, and when you just read them on a paper, it seems like they're so simple, like it's common sense, right? Well, it's not as common as you might think. There are a bunch of ways in which you can mess it up, and hopefully this has shown you some of the ways you could mess it up so that you can avoid messing it up. And as I've discovered through teaching people, it seems like there are some very common things that happen that people don't understand that they do that are unsafe. One of the ones I'll do a whole video on this, but one of the things that people mess up frequently is breaking rule number 1. This is probably the one that gets broken the most, or number 2. Hard to say, but I talked about how they often rack around in the chamber or whatever, and then they pass their gun in front of their hand or whatever, or however it comes about. Another way people mess this one up is after they rack around in the chamber, maybe they hold it out like this, they go from low ready, maybe then they do something like this, and they bring their gun up to bear by doing what I call kind of a Charlie's Angels thing. It's a movie from the 90s. Maybe they'll bring it up like this, they'll bring it out in front. So they're passing it dangerously close to their face, right? This is not a safe practice. However, we see it in the movies all the time. And I think that's where people get the idea. So, if you're somebody who's observing somebody else, those are little things to look for. Another one you see a lot is when people are going to unholster their gun, and maybe they're going to make ready their gun for a competition or wherever. They will have their gun in a holster. Maybe they'll grab a mag and they will bring the gun up like this and put their mag into the gun. Now, obviously, this is another breaking of the rule, right? It's breaking rule number 1. However, when you're actually doing it, it's very easy to mess it up. It's very easy to get caught up in the moment. Well, that's what kind of differentiates somebody who is experienced and is very disciplined and diligent about the safety rules from somebody who is new and somebody who makes, quite frankly, all the rest of the gun owners scared and very anxious and very nervous, is when they are not deliberate with their safety. I talked about trigger discipline, right? Keeping your finger off the trigger is a discipline. It doesn't just happen naturally. It's not like, this is not a natural motion. This is a trained motion. You have to train yourself to know every time I pick this gun up, it's off the trigger like this. And as soon as I'm on target ready to shoot, then I can put it on, take some shots. That is trained. People that are more deliberate with that, and typically the way you see people more deliberate or not is when they are reloading. So maybe they finish shooting, bang, 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 bang. Then they will take their finger off the trigger. They'll rotate, they'll hit their mag release. They keep their finger off the trigger. They grab a new mag, shove it in, keep their finger off the trigger, rack around in, bring it up, then take some shots. Those are the kinds of things you admire in other people. You say, that person's got really good trigger discipline. They're really diligent about it. They're really specific about that. I like that. Makes us feel safe, makes us feel better. You also want to kind of go slow at the beginning. If you're first shooting, take your time. Take your time with every shot. Try to make every shot be as accurate as you can. Speed will come. Don't rush yourself thinking, that guy over there is shooting way faster than me. I should shoot faster too, right? Not at the beginning. Don't worry about that. Just take your time. Remember your safety rules. All the other gun owners, everyone here, myself included as a teacher, as a person who's teaching you maybe, I don't care if you hit the target. The first time, that's at really low on the priority list. What is at the very top of the priority list is that you are safe and that we're all safe. And at the end of the day, that's what everyone wants. We all want everyone to be safe. So hopefully these rules have been helpful for you to see kind of some ways in which people do it wrong, and hopefully they give you ideas of how to do it right. Maybe you're already someone who knows all this stuff, but seeing it in a different way made some things click. You say, oh, okay. Maybe you try to avoid doing those, or maybe you have a friend who you want to help avoid doing those. Safety is all of our responsibility. Everyone in the gun world, everyone who is at the range, we are all range safety officers. If you see somebody doing something unsafe, you can either tell them directly or go tell the range safety officer, whoever's on duty helping you. Safety is non-negotiable. Don't ever compromise on safety. So these have been the 4 rules of gun safety. I'm going to do another video on exceptions to the rules of gun safety. Now that's going to be an exciting video. So hopefully this is helpful for you. My name is Jonathan with Steel Bear Academy. Take care. Bye-bye.